Hey there to our 193 subscribers, our future subscribers, and all the people that secretly watch us without subscribing. Today I bring you 4 stories about the most famous historical crimes that I could find in Modoc County, California prior to 1950. I will do my best to tell those stories with an open mind. The first story I'm bringing to you is about the Modoc War of 1872 to 1873. In 1873, a violent event shook Northern California and Southern Oregon, what newspapers called the Modoc Massacre. It took place in the lava beds near Tule Lake, a harsh volcanic landscape that's now part of the Lava Beds National Monument. But I will explain to you what started all of it back to 1872. The Modocs were a Native American tribe who lived around the Lost River and Tule Lake areas. They were related to the Klamath people but had their own leadership and territory. When white settlers began claiming land in the 1850s, the U.S. government forced the Modocs to move onto the Klamath Reservation in Oregon. The Modocs were treated poorly there and had long-standing conflicts with the Klamath tribe. Eventually, their leader, Kintapus, who the army called Captain Jack, led his people back to their homeland. The U.S. government saw that as defiance and sent troops to remove them again. That conflict became known as the Modoc War. The Modocs had fewer than 60 warriors, but they knew the terrain well and turned the lava beds into a stronghold. They fought off hundreds of soldiers for months, surviving on almost nothing. In early 1873, the government tried to negotiate peace. A commission was formed that included General Edward Canby, Reverend Dr. Eleazar Thomas, and Indian agent Alfred Meacham. They hoped to persuade the Modocs to surrender peacefully and return to the reservation. On April 11, 1873, they met with Captain Jack and several Modoc leaders under what was supposed to be a flag of truce. Accounts of what happened next differ. Most official reports say Captain Jack suddenly pulled a gun and shot General Canby, while another warrior, usually identified as Boston Charlie, shot Reverend Thomas. Meacham was badly wounded and might have been killed if not for a Modoc interpreter named Toby Riddle, also known as Winema, who shouted a warning that soldiers were coming. That distracted the attackers and saved Meacham's life. Some Modoc descendants later said the meeting wasn't an ambush, but a desperate act. They believed the peace talks were a trap and that if they surrendered, they'd be executed anyway. The truth isn't entirely clear, but what's certain is that 2 men died and peace was no longer an option. News spread quickly. In Wairika, citizens mourned the deaths and blamed government officials for trusting the Modocs. Newspapers claimed the victims' bodies had been stripped, though later historians suggested that part was likely exaggerated to stir outrage against Native Americans. After the killings, the Army launched a full-scale campaign. By late spring, most of the Modocs had been captured. 6 leaders were tried by military court at Fort Klamath in Oregon. 4 of them, Captain Jack, Sconchin John, Boston Charlie, and Black Jim, were sentenced to death and hanged in October 1873. 2 others, Barnshow and Slowluck, had their sentences reduced by President Grant. They were sent to Alcatraz, which was already a military prison long before it became famous. They eventually survived and were later moved to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, with the rest of the Modoc people. After the executions, the bodies of the 4 hanged men were decapitated and their heads sent to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C. That was considered normal scientific practice at the time, though today it's viewed as deeply disrespectful. The Modoc War ended with the tribe shattered. Survivors were forced from their homeland to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Years later, a few were allowed to return to Oregon, and today Modoc descendants live in both places. The lava beds remain sacred ground, a reminder of their strength and loss. This wasn't an equal conflict. The Modocs fought for their homeland, while the government fought to enforce its control over it. The war ended the same way many did in the 1800s, with native people displaced, their leaders executed, and their stories often told or even mistold by others. But the Modocs' resistance remains one of the most remarkable in Western history, a story of a small group who stood their ground against impossible odds. The second story is about the legally upheld hanging of 1886. A rancher named John F. Sherman, originally from Ohio, had been living in Siskiyou County for some time when he decided to move to Modoc County with his wife. His brother Gideon, who lived in Alturas, encouraged him to come see the area. Excited for a fresh start, Sherman and his wife sold their property and packed their belongings into a springboard wagon. They were joined for part of the journey by a young woman who planned to ride with them as far as Happy Camp. A few miles along their route, the party encountered a man named Roland Korb, resting under a juniper tree. He asked for a ride to their destination, and they agreed. Not long after, shots rang out. One of Sherman's horses was killed, and Sherman himself was struck in the chest. His wife tried to help him and was hit in the hand. Korb returned fire despite being wounded, helping to fend off the attackers, who witnesses described as at least 3 Native Americans. Friendly Pit River Indians arrived shortly afterward, likely preventing further harm. The historical record does not note what became of the young woman who had been traveling with them. The wounded were transported to the nearest settlement, where Sheriff Chris Ratchford from Alturas was summoned. Months later, he returned with 2 men, Albert Isaacs and Applegate Jack. The exact circumstances of the arrests are fully recorded, though family accounts indicate Ratchford watched a cabin near Bend, Oregon, and arrested the men when they came out for water. Isaacs was convicted of first-degree murder, while Applegate Jack was released for lack of evidence. Isaacs reportedly admitted some involvement in the crime, but refused to name any accomplices. The commonly cited motive was robbery, specifically that Sherman carried money from selling his property in another county. But this explanation is both speculative and illogical. How would a random attacker have known about a sale in a different county? Executions in California were handled at the county level in 1886, falling to the responsibility of Sheriff Ratchford. With help from local pioneers, he built a scaffold on the back of the second floor of the Modoc County Courthouse on the site where the Veterans Memorial Hall now stands. The platform had a 25-foot drop, and a fence was constructed to keep onlookers at a safe distance. On May 28, 1886, a crowd gathered. Isaacs refused the customary black hood and stepped calmly to the noose. The sheriff's son, John Ratchford, then 16, climbed onto the fence his father had built so he could watch the execution up close and narrate what was going on to the people below. When the trap was triggered by accident prematurely, it sent Isaacs downward before the rope was properly adjusted. The fall jerked sharply and death came quickly. His body was taken to the outer cemetery behind the Alturas Creamery. Over the years, both the grave and its marker were lost. Isaac's hanging remains the only recorded legal execution in Modoc County history. Many aspects of the case are uncertain. The full truth of the crime, the identities of all involved, and the motive may never be known. What survives are court records, witness testimony, and a few personal recollections, like that of the sheriff's son, offering a glimpse into a rare instance of frontier justice carried out under the law. The third story is about the infamous 1901 lynchings in Lookout. It was in May 1901 when the townspeople of Lookout, California had finally had enough from what they referred to as the Hall Gang. The small group consisted of Calvin and Mary Hall's son James, Mary's older son Frank, Mary's youngest son Martin Wilson, and her boyfriend Dan Yantis. I would like to note that there is some discrepancy in the records as to whether Frank was also Calvin's. Some sources say that he was, some say Calvin refused to claim him, and he's not listed as one of their children they had together in another source. But another source says he claimed all of her children as his own. Anyway, James, Frank, Martin, and Dan were said to have been terrorizing the town. It started off as pranks, but eventually turned deadly. They were accused of a long string of thefts, vandalism, and mutilation of livestock. Calvin was arrested alongside the gang for suspicion of these crimes, but he was released because it was presumed that he was innocent. Whether their belief was because he was in his 70s, he was never in trouble, or because he was highly respected is unclear. But I do find it highly unlikely that Calvin was involved based on all of these factors. Due to the small size of the village of Lookout, there wasn't a jail. So pending an indictment from the courts in Alturas, the gang was held in the local Myers Hotel under guard. Two of their victims went to Alturas to request the felony indictments and were informed that the charges were misdemeanors. And to add insult to injury, it's been stated that Frank and Dan were threatening to poison the local water sources out of revenge for their arrests. Calvin chose to stay near them, possibly in the same hotel, while waiting to see what was going to happen. Then, sometime during the night of May 31st, a mob of townspeople, stated to be somewhere between 17 to 40 people depending on who's telling the story, put grain sack masks over their heads, armed themselves, and stormed the hotel. They dragged the Hall gang out of the hotel. They came back later for Calvin out of fear that he would retaliate for what they had done. It was early the next morning when it was finally discovered by everybody in the town what they had done with this boy and these men. The small town of Lookout, California woke up to a shocking and horrifying sight. The missing boy and 4 men were all hanging off a bridge over the Pitt River. The sight must have been surreal as they gently swayed in the breeze. It didn't take long for word to spread and the townspeople to come see the sight for themselves. The fear and frustration of the townspeople had been put to rest at the expense of Calvin and the gang. It was vigilante justice in a chilling way the town had never seen before. Mary and Calvin's daughters, Mary and Dora, as well as their son Charles, were never implicated in the events. But the older Mary and her younger daughter Agnes were going to be punished too. Nooses were prepared, but for some reason the mob changed the plan. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community, marking one of the most infamous lynchings in California history. The aftermath was chaotic. The town was shaken, and newspapers reported the event widely. Grand juries and legal authorities became involved, but records of the prosecution and trial of those that committed the lynchings are unclear. No one knows for certain what the exact legal outcomes were. What is clear, however, is that a violent act carried out by a mob took the lives of 5 people, including a man who had been released because the law considered him innocent, and the full weight of justice was never brought down on the perpetrators. Looking back, the lynching in Lookout shows how quickly fear, anger, and frustration can override law and reason, especially in a small, isolated community. It's a stark reminder that mob violence doesn't just punish the guilty, it can destroy innocent lives and leave a lasting mark on a town's history. While we can't know the full truth of Calvin's involvement, if any, logic and the evidence we have suggest it was highly unlikely he played a part in the crimes. And yet, he, his sons, and Mary's boyfriend were all executed in a single brutal act, with no one held accountable. The events of that night remain a chilling example of the consequences of taking justice into one's own hands, and they leave us reflecting on how impunity and unchecked anger can reverberate through time, shaping patterns of violence and injustices that are still with us today. The fourth and final story is actually the one that delayed making this video. I couldn't find much information anywhere. I could not find any information at the Modoc County Museum except the date of the newspaper article, and the online archives I tried to access seemed to be corrupted. So I made 2 trips to the local library just to get the clearest copy I could of what appears to be the only known article about this event, from the Alturas Plain Dealer, dated December 19, 1934. According to that article, the Alturas branch of the Bank of America was held up during the noon hour on a Friday by a lone bandit. At the time, only 3 employees were in the bank: Ove Nielsen, who was at the window, Beth Walls, who was working on an adding machine, and Vince Court, who was near the back door. The robber, described as a dark man about 6 feet tall, entered the bank carrying a nickel-plated .32 revolver, a common and easily concealable firearm at that time. The newspaper reported he was possibly Mexican or Native American, based on Ove Nielsen's account, though eyewitness descriptions in stressful situations can be unreliable. The bandit may also have worn a wig, mustache, or other disguises which could have affected how he was perceived. He ordered Ove to fill a gunny sack with cash, about $472 in total, and then demanded more, though Ove was able to conceal some of it. And securing the loot, the bandit made his escape in a black 1930 Ford coupe. Jesse Hughes reported his 1930 Ford coupe stolen 2 days earlier, and it was later found abandoned outside the town with the engine still warm, though the exact location is unclear. The article mentioned it being above the George Clark place, but records today don't confirm exactly where that was. Some evidence suggests it could have been along a route toward Nevada via Cedarville, which could have been a safer driving route in winter of 1934 than through Ravendale. Authorities initially suspected and arrested 3 men in Ravendale, but they were quickly released when eyewitnesses claimed it wasn't them. The fact that they suspected these men, though, leaves a lot of speculation about the escape route that the bandit took. The article also notes that the bandit may have been in town for a couple of days before the robbery, possibly scouting the bank, according to witnesses, and that he purchased gas shortly before entering the bank. Taken together, these details suggest the bandit was likely an outsider passing through rather than a local resident, someone moving through the small town, committing crimes along a possible route to Nevada. And while the record ends there, it leaves room for speculation. The car that was used in the escape may have been the same car that was reported stolen 2 days earlier by Jesse Hughes. Could it be that Hughes himself staged the theft to aid in the getaway? There's no evidence for this, but the idea crossed the minds of some. In the 1930s, when small-town banks were easy targets and clever criminals often stayed one step ahead, it wouldn't have been impossible. The truth of the Alturas Bank of America robbery may never be fully known. Even today, it's a story that seems almost lost in history, with only the single newspaper article documenting the escape of a lone criminal in Modoc County. Interestingly, this is actually the first of only 2 known bank robberies in Alturas. The second occurred roughly 50 years later, which I'll try to cover in a future video about more recent events in the area. Hopefully you guys found these stories as fascinating as I have. I have been asked to do some more recent stories. I do want to be respectful to the families of the more recent stories, so please have patience with me as I try to figure out how I want to tackle these. If you have suggestions for additional stories, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you have context that would help me in putting the information together, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share, and get your friends to do the same thing. Bye.